Chris's question is, hi Mark and Joe, my background is in psychiatric nursing. And over the years, I came to recognize and accept that some people are very hard to help to any significant degree. Their difficulties can be complex and often compounded by personality issues. As a therapist, my stumbling block comes when I encounter a client whose problem has some evident secondary gain, which does not appear to be related to an attempt to fulfill an unmet need, but rather which has developed into a divisive and manipulatory mechanism that serves to exempt people from doing things they simply do not wish to do. I question whether there is some inner conflict going on as they come initially for help, but then signs of resistance appear when they learn they can actually be helped. This may, of course, be a form of attention-seeking, although I appreciate that, particularly for those that have built their lives around a problem, it could be daunting to change. I've thought about using parts therapy, but I'm curious to know what approach you might take with such people. Thank you, Chris.
So that's a very interesting question, Chris, and thank you for that. And I guess, it can be daunting for people to feel that they might suddenly change if they've never felt particularly, happy or content or engaged in their life, and suddenly the thought that they may be able to control their addictions or they may be able to develop healthy relationships it's a little bit like exploring a new country. There might be fantastic things in that country for you, but might also be a fear factor. So one thing that I sometimes say to people who I deem to be perhaps a little bit afraid of change is that when you actually change, it feels very natural. It feels natural to be a butterfly if you're a butterfly, of course, but the grub before it becomes a butterfly perhaps couldn't imagine that it would feel natural to be up there flying around. There's an old illustrated cartoon I remember seeing once where one caterpillar is saying to the other, looking up at a butterfly, he says, "You never get me in one of those things." But of course, when you are in one of those things, when you are the butterfly and flying, it feels, because you're in that situation, in that context, suddenly feels like this is the way you were meant to be all along. So I sometimes talk to clients in that term. And I agree, some people certainly are harder to help than others. What do you do with someone who seems to want to be rescued from a subway, railway track, but then wriggles away and makes themselves, sort of turns over and makes themselves comfortable every time you try and assist them out of harm's way because the train's coming, and some people can be a bit like that. I think it's important that we don't assume that if therapy doesn't seem to be working, it's because the client is receiving some unconscious or even conscious benefit from staying in the problem. I don't think we should assume that as a sort of theoretical thing, because I think the majority of clients genuinely do want rid of their emotional problems. But on occasion, we might seem to spot the pattern of self-sabotage, and it can seem as though the client is thwarting attempts to help them, And I think you said in your question, Chris, and I've written this down, so I'm quoting back to you, but you said, what do we do when the client problem has some evident secondary gain, which doesn't appear to be related to an attempt to fulfill an unmet need, but rather which has developed into a divisive and manipulatory mechanism that serves to exempt people from doing things they simply do not wish to do. Okay, so I think I understood that. So all emotionally driven behavior, whether towards some action or away from it, has to do with the drive toward the completion of some or other or many primal emotional needs. Now, the need may have morphed into a kind of greed, like an addiction. So, for example, someone may get adequate levels of attention in their life, but found it easier to elicit attention from others, not through developing their own capacity to give attention to others and thereby receive it in return, but by acting out some histrionic behavior. Okay, and they may have, you learn that you get pleasure from receiving attention from other people, even negative attention sometimes, and so you want more and more and more of it. And you have to be weaned off it, kind of thing, and that can happen. So it sounds a strange thing to say. So it's not just that the more attention you get, the better. because, especially if you feel that suddenly you can't have a weekend with a little bit less attention because you're so addicted to it. So that kind of thing can certainly be unconsciously driven, perhaps. And if the person is primarily meeting their need for attention through having a problem, you suspect, or attention from their partner, or they feel their partner can't leave them because whilst they've got the problem, but if they get better, then their partner might leave. If you suspect that's going on, then you certainly need to perhaps make efforts to help them meet that need, whatever it is, in a healthy way, and reassure them that they can still get what they need without having that happen. But you might need to reassure them sort of metaphorically, because certainly if you do it too starkly, then they may just draw away from you, make an excuse as to why you're not the therapist for them, or now isn't the time to change, and so forth. Some people certainly can be contrary, what I mean by that is they're not just disagreeing with you because they disagree with you on a point. They will disagree with you on principle, So, and someone's contrary when you summarize what they've just said, assuming that you'll now be in agreement with one another, and then they turn around and they disagree. This is a pattern you can spot in some people. And it's not simple disagreement, it's automatic and uncontrolled disagreement with whatever you say. Okay. And of course, people like that are quite difficult to get along with. For example, I was chatting to a woman socially recently, and she was talking about a situation and described it as depressing. And a few moments later, I said that, that must be depressing for you. And of course, she just said it was depressing, and she shook her head, and she said, no, I wouldn't say it's depressing, even though that's exactly what she just did say. She said, rather, it's dispiriting. And then, I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I wanted to see whether this was an automatic need to oppose syndrome. So a few moments later, I sort of said, well, that must be dispiriting for you. And she again shook her head and said, no, it's more depressing than dispiriting. So whatever I said, she said the opposite. And that you do spot that, maybe not to that marked degree, but you do spot that kind of thing going on with clients sometimes. So every conversation might be a tussle, and it might be because perhaps they they might be in a relationship where everything's argument, and they're not used to having a conversation which isn't conflictual. Okay, or it may be because that they have a need for status, and they're unconsciously seeking a sense of status, even in just a light social conversation. The drive for status is so high, or the drive for controlling things, a sense of control is so high that they can't even relax in a social conversation, and they have to kind of win, the conversation or the interchange, whatever it might be. And of course, the principle here is that if we see a client sort of resisting, okay, then we can encourage that resistance, because resistance is a force, So we want the smoker, for example, or the alcoholic, to be resistant. We want that resistance. We don't want no resistance to be in their personality. But of course, we don't want it directed at us, but directed at what's really pushing them around, which is the cigarettes or the alcohol. So we can, begin to describe, or ask them questions like, how does that alcohol, how does it lie to you? How does it manipulate you? How does it push you around? And so forth. And more subtly than I've just described there. So that would be a way. But also, we can, if someone's resistant to relaxing, for example, and they're contrary, they have this contrary element to them, which you will find tracks alongside a secondary gain. Okay, the person will often present it as a bit contrary. Then you can encourage the contrariness. Just as the old story about Milton Erickson when he was a farm boy, and his father was trying to push a cow into a barn, and the cow wasn't budging, wasn't moving. And so the young Erickson intuitively went up to the cow and pulled it sharply by the tail. And in order to resist being pulled backwards by the tail, it went into the barn. Okay. And, so they pull, you push, they push, you pull is a principle. when dealing with contrariness. So somebody who's contrary about relaxing and so they can't relax, they never relax, and they're a bit scared to relax or whatever. We might suggest to them that we don't think they should relax in this session. Many people do relax in this session, but maybe it's not for them. And, we don't want them to completely relax, but maybe just relax a tiny bit, but not for very long. Okay. So if their need to conflict with you is so strong and automatic, then of course the response to that would be to relax deeply. Okay. And this does work. It sounds absurd, but it really does work with clients or with anybody as a principle, rather than just, trying to force them to be a certain way. It can be very powerful. Yes, so I've made a few points there. I think I hope some of them or something was useful in there for you, Chris, isn't it? Yes, but good question.